The storm arrived without warning, transforming the airport into a battlefield of delayed flights and stranded passengers. Alexander Schmidt gripped the steering wheel of the luxury sedan, raindrops hammering against the windshield like nature's own percussion symphony. The airport pickup zone had become a chaotic maze of honking horns, flashing hazard lights, and travelers running desperately through the downpour with newspapers held over their heads like makeshift shields. Alexander's phone buzzed against the leather seat beside him, displaying a message from the transportation company's dispatch center. Client Jessica Morrison, Flight 447, canceled. Return to base. He exhaled slowly, the kind of sigh that carried the weight of a man who had learned to expect disappointment. This was supposed to be his final pickup of the evening, and now he might actually make it home before his 8-year-old son Davy fell asleep. Perhaps tonight would be one of those rare evenings where he could read bedtime stories in different voices, making the characters come alive with the theatrical flair that always made Davy giggle uncontrollably. As Alexander reached for the gear shift to leave, the terminal's automatic doors hissed open with mechanical precision. Through the sheets of rain, a woman emerged, dragging a sophisticated leather travel case behind her. She wore no protective coat, just an elegant charcoal blazer that was already becoming soaked, clinging to her frame as she stood motionless on the curb. There was something almost ethereal about her stillness amidst the chaos, as if she existed in a different dimension where storms couldn't touch her spirit, only her clothes. What struck Alexander most wasn't her obvious affluence or the way she carried herself with quiet authority, but the expression on her face. She looked lost, not geographically but existentially, like someone who had just realized they were standing at the wrong crossroads of their life. Her eyes swept across the pickup area with a mixture of confusion and resignation that spoke of deeper disappointments than missed flights. "Miss Morrison?" Alexander called through his partially lowered window, rain immediately speckling his face. The woman turned toward him, and for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, she simply stared. Her lips parted as if she intended to correct him, to explain that she wasn't Jessica Morrison, that there had been some mistake. But then something shifted in her expression, a flicker of recognition that seemed to surprise even her, followed by what looked like desperate hope. "Yes," she said finally, her voice carrying an odd mixture of certainty and wonder. "I suppose I am." Alexander hesitated, studying her face more carefully. Something about her seemed familiar, like a melody he couldn't quite place but knew he had heard before. The rational part of his mind whispered warnings about picking up unscheduled passengers, about company policies and liability issues. But there was something in her eyes that reminded him of looking into a mirror during his darkest moments, and that recognition made him unlock the doors without further question. She slid into the back seat, bringing with her the scent of expensive perfume mixed with rain and something else he couldn't identify, something that felt like memories trying to surface. Water dripped from her hair onto the pristine leather upholstery, but she didn't apologize or seem concerned about the mess. Instead, she sat with perfect posture, hands folded in her lap, staring out the window as if the city lights held answers to questions she hadn't yet learned to ask. As Alexander navigated through the congested airport traffic, he found himself glancing repeatedly at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her features were striking, but not in an obvious way, refined in a manner that suggested both natural beauty and the kind of confidence that came from years of commanding rooms full of powerful people. Yet beneath that polished exterior, he sensed a vulnerability that she worked very hard to keep hidden. "Terrible weather for flying," Alexander offered, attempting to break the silence that had grown heavy between them. She nodded without really acknowledging him, her attention still focused on the rain-streaked window. "Some things are worth waiting for," she replied quietly, and the way she said it suggested she wasn't talking about weather delays or transportation schedules. The drive continued in comfortable silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic swish of windshield wipers and the distant rumble of thunder. Alexander noticed that she never checked her phone, never gave him an address, never asked about their destination. It was as if she trusted him completely to take her wherever she needed to go, a level of faith that both honored and unnerved him. When they finally arrived at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, its facade glowing warmly against the stormy night, Alexander expected her to simply thank him and disappear into the lobby like every other passenger he had ever transported. Instead, as he opened her door and she stepped onto the rain-slicked pavement, she turned to face him with an expression that made his heart skip in a way he hadn't experienced in years. "You really don't remember me, do you?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of rain hitting the hotel's canvas awning. The question hit him like a physical blow, sudden and unexpected. He found himself searching her face more intently, looking for clues in the curve of her smile or the particular shade of green in her eyes. "Should I remember you?" he asked, though even as the words left his mouth, something deep in his chest began to stir, like a sleeping giant awakening after years of slumber. She studied him for a long moment, her head tilted slightly to one side, rain droplets clinging to her eyelashes like tiny diamonds. "No," she said finally, though her tone suggested the opposite. "I suppose not." She turned and walked toward the hotel entrance, her heels clicking against the wet pavement with the precise rhythm of someone who had learned to walk confidently even when her world was falling apart. Alexander remained standing beside his car long after she had disappeared through the revolving doors, watching the space where she had been as if she might materialize again. Something about their brief encounter had shaken him in ways he couldn't begin to understand. It wasn't attraction, though she was undeniably beautiful. It wasn't curiosity, though she had certainly piqued his interest. It was something deeper, more primal, like the recognition one feels when hearing a lullaby their mother used to sing, even when they can't remember the words. Inside the hotel lobby, Sophia Whitfield stood at the marble reception desk, her wet blazer creating a small puddle on the polished floor. The desk clerk, impeccably dressed and trained to handle any situation with diplomatic grace, looked up expectantly. "Good evening, ma'am. May I have your name for the reservation?" Sophia hesitated, 1,000 different identities flashing through her mind. She had been Sophia Whitfield, CEO, for so long that she sometimes forgot there had ever been any other version of herself. But tonight, standing in this lobby with rain still dripping from her hair and the memory of kind eyes fresh in her mind, she felt like someone entirely different. "Sophia Whitfield," she said finally, though the name felt strange on her tongue, like wearing clothes that no longer fit properly. The clerk's fingers danced across his keyboard with practiced efficiency, then paused. He frowned slightly, checking his screen again. "I'm terribly sorry, Miss Whitfield, but I don't see a reservation under your name. Perhaps it's under a different name or confirmation number." Sophia smiled, the expression carrying years of experience in handling unexpected complications. "That's quite all right. I don't have a reservation. I'll need a room for tonight, possibly longer." The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly, but his professionalism never wavered. "Of course, ma'am. We have several options available. Would you prefer a suite with a city view, or perhaps something quieter facing the courtyard?" "The quietest room you have," Sophia replied without hesitation. "Preferably as far from the elevators as possible." She needed silence tonight, space to think about what had just happened and why seeing Alexander's face had felt like finding a piece of herself she hadn't realized was missing. Later, in her suite on the 15th floor, Sophia stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, still wearing her damp clothes, watching the city lights blur through the rain-streaked glass. The room was luxurious in an understated way, all soft grays and warm golds, designed to make guests feel pampered without being ostentatious. But to Sophia, it felt like a beautiful prison, elegant but empty. She had spent 12 years searching for him. 12 years since that night in the hospital when her world had shattered into pieces so small she thought they could never be reassembled. She had been 26 then, young enough to believe that tragedy was something that happened to other people, naive enough to think that love and determination could overcome any obstacle. The night her father died, she had sat in that sterile hospital corridor, completely alone, surrounded by the antiseptic smell of industrial cleaning products and the constant hum of fluorescent lights. That's when he had appeared, not like a knight in shining armor from some fairy tale, but like an ordinary angel in worn jeans and a faded sweater. He had been there for his own reason, his own crisis, but when he saw her falling apart on that uncomfortable plastic bench, he had simply sat down beside her. He hadn't offered empty platitudes or tried to fix what couldn't be fixed. He had just stayed, offering his presence like a shelter in a storm. Sophia She never learned his name that night. Hospital policy kept patient information confidential, and in her grief, she had been too shattered to think about asking. By the time she had recovered enough to return to the hospital looking for him, the staff couldn't help her without more information. She had hired private investigators, checked hospital employment records, even tried facial recognition software as it became available. Nothing had worked. But tonight, when he had called her Miss Morrison and she had seen those same compassionate eyes that had anchored her to sanity during the worst night of her life, she had known instantly. Time had aged him. Responsibility had carved lines around his eyes, and there was a weariness to him that spoke of his own battles fought and survived. But the essential kindness that had saved her 12 years ago remained unchanged. The next morning, Alexander arrived at work early, as was his habit, with Davy in tow. The boy was still rubbing sleep from his eyes, his school backpack dragging behind him like a reluctant pet. "Why do Mondays exist?" Davy mumbled, his 8-year-old philosophy already showing signs of world weariness that both amused and concerned his father. "Mondays exist to make us appreciate Fridays," Alexander replied, ruffling his son's already messy brown hair. "Besides, Mrs. Patterson said you have that science presentation today. The one about volcanoes that we practiced all weekend." Davy's face brightened slightly at the reminder, his enthusiasm for explosive geological phenomena temporarily overriding his morning grumpiness. Alexander left Davy with Maria, the hotel's assistant manager who had kindly agreed to watch him during the early morning hours when childcare wasn't available. It was an arrangement that worked for everyone. Maria enjoyed Davy's company. Davy got to do his homework in the elegant hotel lobby, and Alexander could work without worrying about his son's safety. As Alexander walked through the lobby, adjusting his tie and preparing for another day of navigating traffic and managing the personalities of demanding clients, his eyes automatically swept across the guest registry tablet mounted behind the reception desk. One name jumped out at him like a neon sign: Sophia Whitfield, room 1547. The woman from last night was still here. He told himself it didn't matter. Guests extended their stays all the time for business reasons, personal preferences, or simply because they enjoyed the hotel's amenities. But he couldn't shake the memory of her question. "You really don't remember me, do you?" The words had haunted his dreams, mixing with fragmented images he couldn't quite piece together. Around midday, while Alexander was helping an elderly couple navigate the hotel's restaurant reservation system, speaking to them in their native German to help them feel more comfortable, Sophia emerged from the elevator. She had transformed overnight from the rain-soaked woman he had picked up at the airport into someone who commanded attention simply by walking into a room. Her navy blue dress was perfectly tailored, her hair arranged in a sophisticated style that somehow managed to look both professional and approachable. But what caught Alexander's attention wasn't her obvious success or the way other guests' conversations paused as she passed. It was the way she moved through the lobby, observing everything with the intensity of someone who was looking for something specific. When their eyes met across the busy space, the recognition was mutual and immediate, like lightning finding its target. Sophia paused near the concierge desk, ostensibly studying a display of local restaurant menus, but Alexander could feel her watching him as he finished helping the German couple. There was something deliberate about her presence, as if she had timed her appearance to coincide with his work schedule. The thought should have made him uncomfortable, but instead, it filled him with a strange anticipation. That evening, after Alexander had completed his scheduled pickups and returned to the hotel, he found Sophia sitting in the lobby's quiet reading area, a leather-bound notebook open on her lap. She wasn't writing, just sitting and watching the early evening crowd of business travelers and tourists move through the space like actors in a play she was trying to understand. "Miss Whitfield," Alexander said, approaching her chair with the same careful courtesy he showed all hotel guests. She looked up, and he was struck again by the intelligence in her eyes, the way they seemed to see more than most people revealed. "I hope your stay has been comfortable so far." "Very comfortable, thank you," she replied, closing her notebook and giving him her full attention. "You have an excellent staff here. And please, call me Sophia." There was something in the way she said her name, as if she were testing how it sounded in his voice, checking to see if it triggered any memories. "Alexander," he said, extending his hand. When their fingers touched, He felt a jolt of recognition so strong it was almost physical. Her hand was soft, but her grip was firm, the handshake of someone accustomed to making deals and commanding respect. But there was something else, something familiar about the size and shape of her hand in his. "Alexander," she repeated, and hearing his name in her voice was like hearing a song he had loved but forgotten. "Would you care to join me for coffee? I find hotel lobbies fascinating places to observe human nature, but it's much more interesting with company." They sat together in the lobby cafe, 2 cups of coffee cooling between them as conversation flowed with surprising ease. Sophia asked about his work, his life in the city, careful questions that felt like gentle excavation rather than intrusion. Alexander found himself talking more than he usually did with strangers, telling her about Davy's latest school projects and his own journey from architectural dreams to the practical reality of transportation services. "You wanted to build things," Sophia observed, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "What changed?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering how much truth to share with this elegant stranger who somehow didn't feel like a stranger at all. "Life happened," he said finally. "My wife passed away when Davy was just a baby. Suddenly, stability mattered more than dreams." Sophia's expression softened, and Alexander saw something flicker across her face that looked like shared understanding. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, and the words carried weight that suggested she knew personally what loss felt like. "It must have been incredibly difficult, raising a child alone while grieving." "The hardest part wasn't the practical challenges," Alexander admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "It was learning to believe that good things could still happen, that hope wasn't just setting yourself up for disappointment." He looked at her more closely, noting the way she held her coffee cup with both hands, as if drawing warmth from it. "What about you? Family?" Sophia shook her head slowly. "Not anymore. I lost my parents when I was young. Built my career into a kind of family, I suppose, but it's not the same thing." She paused, studying his face with an intensity that made him feel as if she were memorizing his features. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? Like the person you were meant to be got derailed somewhere along the way?" The question hit closer to home than Alexander was comfortable admitting. Before he could answer, Davy came running across the lobby, having finished his after-school snack with Maria. "Dad, did you see the lady from yesterday?" Davy skidded to a stop beside their table, his eyes bright with excitement. "She's right here." Sophia turned to Davy with a smile that transformed her entire face, making her look younger and more approachable. "Hello again. How was school today?" Davy launched into an enthusiastic description of his volcano presentation, complete with hand gestures and sound effects for the explosive parts. Sophia listened with the kind of attention adults rarely gave children, asking follow-up questions and showing genuine interest in the scientific details Davy had memorized. Watching them together, Alexander felt something shift inside his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. Sophia didn't talk down to Davy or humor him the way most adults did with children. She spoke to him as if his thoughts and opinions mattered, as if 8-year-old insights about volcanic activity were as valuable as any boardroom discussion. "Miss Sophia," Davy said suddenly, using the formal address Alexander had taught him for addressing adults. "Do you want to see my drawing of the volcano? I made it extra realistic with different colors for the lava layers." Sophia's eyes lit up with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. "I would love to see it, Davy. I bet it's amazing." As they walked toward the corner where Davy had left his backpack, Alexander followed, observing the easy way Sophia interacted with his son. There was something natural about it, as if she had experience with children or simply possessed an innate understanding of how to connect with them. When Davy pulled out his drawing, carefully unfolding a piece of construction paper covered in bright reds and oranges, Sophia examined it with the seriousness of an art critic reviewing a masterpiece. "This is extraordinary, Davy," she said, pointing to specific details. "I can see you really understand how the magma moves through the Earth's layers. And these colors are perfect for showing the different temperatures." Davy beamed under her praise, standing a little taller and speaking with more confidence about his artistic choices. Later that evening, after Davy had gone to bed and Alexander was cleaning up the modest apartment he called home, he found himself thinking about Sophia's question. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" The truth was, he had felt exactly that way for years, as if the real Alexander had died along with his wife Sarah, leaving behind a responsible but hollow version who went through the motions of living without really experiencing joy. But today, watching Sophia interact with Davy, listening to her laugh at his son's jokes and ask thoughtful questions about his interests, Alexander had glimpsed something he thought was lost forever. Not romance, necessarily, though there was an undeniable attraction simmering beneath their polite conversation. It was something deeper, the possibility of genuine connection, of being seen and understood by someone who didn't require him to be anything other than who he was. The next morning brought unexpected drama to the Grand Metropolitan Hotel. Alexander arrived to find the lobby buzzing with unusual activity, staff members moving with the heightened urgency that indicated a significant problem. Maria met him at the employee entrance, her usually calm demeanor showing signs of stress. "What's happening?" Alexander asked, noting the extra security personnel stationed near the main entrance. Maria lowered her voice conspiratorially. "We have a situation with one of our guests. Apparently, someone's been impersonating a VIP client. Management is trying to handle it quietly, but there are concerns about security protocols." Alexander's stomach dropped as an unwelcome thought occurred to him. "Which guest?" he asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. Maria checked her tablet discreetly. "A Miss Morrison. Room 1547. The woman you picked up from the airport 2 nights ago." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Room 1547 was Sophia's room, but she had checked in under the name Sophia Whitfield, not Morrison. Yet he had picked her up as Jessica Morrison, a passenger whose flight had been canceled. Either there had been a massive administrative error, or Sophia had deliberately assumed someone else's identity. Alexander's mind raced through the implications. Had Sophia lied about who she was? Was she some kind of criminal or con artist? But even as these thoughts surfaced, he couldn't reconcile them with the woman who had shown such genuine interest in Davy's volcano drawings, who had listened to his stories about loss and responsibility with real empathy. Before he could decide what to do with this information, the elevator doors opened and Sophia stepped out, dressed impeccably in a charcoal gray suit that spoke of boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations. But there was something different about her today, a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before, as if she were preparing for battle. She walked directly to the front desk, her heels clicking against the marble floor with military precision. Alexander watched from across the lobby as she spoke quietly to the desk clerk, whose expression grew increasingly confused and then concerned. Within minutes, a manager appeared, then another, and what had started as a discreet conversation began to draw attention from other guests. Alexander approached slowly, torn between professional duty and personal concern. As he got closer, he could hear fragments of the conversation. "No reservation under that name. Clearly a misunderstanding. Need to verify your identity." Sophia's voice remained calm and controlled, but Alexander could see the strain in her posture, the way her hands gripped her briefcase a little too tightly. "Excuse me," Alexander interjected, addressing the hotel manager with the authority of someone who had worked in customer service long enough to recognize when a situation was escalating unnecessarily. "I believe there may have been some confusion with the airport pickup. This is Miss Whitfield, whom I transported from the terminal 2 evenings ago." The manager looked between Alexander and Sophia, clearly trying to piece together information that didn't quite align. "Mr. Schmidt, our records show you were scheduled to pick up a Jessica Morrison, whose flight was canceled. But this guest checked in as Sophia Whitfield, with no prior reservation." Sophia looked at Alexander with an expression he couldn't quite read, surprise mixed with something that might have been gratitude. "There seems to have been an error with the transportation service," she said smoothly, her voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to managing corporate crises. "I had arranged for a pickup, but there was confusion about names. I decided to extend my stay to handle some unexpected business." It was a plausible explanation, delivered with just the right amount of authoritative certainty to make questioning it seem unreasonable. The manager nodded slowly, though Alexander could see he wasn't entirely convinced. "Of course, Miss Whitfield. These mix-ups happen occasionally with our transportation partners. I do apologize for any inconvenience." As the small crowd dispersed and normal lobby activity resumed, Sophia turned to Alexander with a look that was equal parts thankful and apprehensive. "Could we speak privately?" she asked, and he could hear the tension beneath her composed exterior. They walked to a quiet corner of the lobby, near the windows that overlooked the hotel's courtyard garden. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of unasked questions hanging between them like morning fog. Finally, Sophia broke the silence. "I owe you an explanation," she said, her voice quieter than he had ever heard it. "And an apology. I wasn't entirely truthful about who I am or why I'm here." Alexander waited, studying her face for clues about what was coming next. "When you called me Miss Morrison at the airport, I should have corrected you immediately. But when I heard that name, when I saw your face, I felt like I was being given a second chance at something I thought I'd lost forever." She took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for what came next. 12 years ago, I was sitting in a hospital corridor. It was the worst night of my life, and I was completely alone. A stranger sat down beside me, didn't say anything, just stayed until I wasn't falling apart anymore. "That stranger was you, Alexander." The words hit him like a physical blow, sudden recognition flooding through him like a dam bursting. The hospital, the night Sarah was in labor, when complications had sent him into the hallway to pace and pray. The young woman on the bench, sobbing with the kind of grief that seemed to echo through the sterile corridors. He had sat beside her, offering what little comfort silence could provide, never thinking he would see her again. "Sophie," he whispered, the nickname coming back to him suddenly. She had whispered it through her tears that night, when he had asked if there was anyone he could call for her. "You're Sophie." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she smiled through them. "You do remember." They stood there in the hotel lobby, surrounded by the mundane activity of guests checking in and out, business travelers hurrying to meetings, tourists planning their days. But for Alexander and Sophia, the world had narrowed to just this moment, this recognition, this impossible second chance. "I looked for you," Sophia continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "For years, I tried to find the man who saved me that night. Not dramatically, not like a movie, but quietly. You reminded me that kindness still existed in the world when I thought it had died with my father." Alexander felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of coincidence and fate that had brought them back together. "I never thought. That night was difficult for both of us. Sarah was having complications, and I was terrified of losing her. When I saw you there, so young and so broken, He trailed off, struggling to find words for something that had felt instinctive rather than planned. "You just stayed," Sophia finished. "You didn't try to fix me or tell me everything would be okay. You just made sure I wasn't alone. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How precious that kind of presence can be?" They talked for hours that day, filling in the gaps of 12 years with careful honesty. Sophia told him about building her company from nothing, channeling her grief into ambition and her loneliness into professional success. Alexander shared his own journey through loss, the challenges of single parenthood, the way he had learned to find joy in small moments with Davy, even when larger happiness seemed impossible. But as the afternoon wore on, Alexander began to feel the weight of their different worlds. Sophia was clearly successful beyond anything he could imagine, comfortable in luxury hotels and presumably accustomed to a lifestyle he could never provide. What did a CEO want with a hotel driver and his 8-year-old son? As if reading his thoughts, Sophia reached across the small cafe table where they had been talking and placed her hand gently over his. "I know what you're thinking," she said softly. "You're wondering what someone like me could possibly want with someone like you. But Alexander, you're thinking about it backward." She leaned forward, her eyes intense and sincere. "I've spent 12 years becoming successful, building a company, accumulating wealth and influence. But I've never again felt as safe as I did sitting on that hospital bench with a stranger who cared enough to stay. I've never felt as genuinely happy as I did yesterday, watching you and Davy together, seeing the kind of father you've become." That evening, Alexander invited Sophia to join them for dinner at the apartment. It was a simple meal, nothing fancy, but Davy was thrilled to have a guest and insisted on showing Sophia his entire collection of science books and model volcanoes. She listened to his explanations with the same serious attention she had shown the day before, asking questions that encouraged him to think more deeply about the subjects he loved. After Davy went to bed, Alexander and Sophia sat together on the small balcony overlooking the city, each holding a cup of tea and sharing comfortable silence punctuated by gentle conversation. The night air was cool but not unpleasant, and the distant sounds of city life created a peaceful backdrop to their growing understanding of each other. "I have a confession," Sophia said, turning slightly in her chair to face him. "I didn't come here for business. I don't have any meetings scheduled, any deals to close. I came because I couldn't stop thinking about that night 12 years ago, and I finally hired a detective to help me find you." Alexander raised his eyebrows in surprise. "A detective?" Sophia nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "I know it sounds excessive, but I had to know. I had to find you and say thank you, even if it led nowhere else. When the detective traced you to this city, I booked a flight immediately. I was planning to observe from a distance, maybe approach you casually, but then you picked me up at the airport and called me by the wrong name, and it felt like fate was giving us both a second chance." The revelation was both touching and overwhelming. Alexander had never considered that their brief encounter 12 years ago had meant as much to her as it apparently had. He had been operating from his own pain that night, seeking his own comfort by offering it to someone else. But hearing that his presence had been significant enough for her to search for him across years and distance was humbling. "What happens now?" Alexander asked, voicing the question that had been growing in his mind all day. "I mean, you have a life, a company, responsibilities. And I have Davy and my work here. This feels incredible, but I don't know how it becomes real." Sophia was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. "I don't know either," she admitted. "But I know I don't want to walk away again. I know that being here with you and Davy feels more like home than anywhere I've lived in years. I know that I've spent 12 years building a successful life, but I've never built a happy one." She turned to look directly at him, her expression open and vulnerable in a way he suspected few people ever saw. "I'm not asking you to figure it all out tonight, Alexander. I'm just asking if you think there might be room in your life for someone who remembers what it feels like to be saved by kindness, and who wants to return that kindness every day for the rest of her life." The question hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Alexander thought about the years he had spent in careful isolation, protecting himself and Davy from the possibility of loss by avoiding the possibility of love. He thought about the warmth he had felt watching Sophia interact with his son, the ease of their conversation, the way she seemed to see him not as a project to be fixed, but as a person to be appreciated. "There's room," he said finally, his voice quiet but certain. "There's been room for a long time. I just forgot how to see it." They sat together under the stars, talking until the early hours of morning about dreams and fears, about the children they had been and the adults they had become, about the possibility of building something beautiful from the foundation of an old kindness. 3 months later, the airport was busy again, but this time the energy was different. Instead of storm and chaos, there was the organized bustle of holiday travel, families reuniting and friends embarking on adventures together. Alexander stood in the pickup area, but he wasn't working today. He was waiting for Sophia, who was returning from a business trip that had taken her away for almost a week. Davy bounced beside him, clutching a handmade welcome home sign decorated with drawings of volcanoes and hearts. "Do you think she missed us?" he asked for the third time in 10 minutes. Alexander smiled, ruffling his son's hair affectionately. "I think she missed us very much, buddy." When Sophia emerged from the terminal, wheeling her familiar leather suitcase behind her, both Alexander and Davy broke into grins. She had been gone less than a week, but her absence had felt longer than it should have, a reminder of how quickly they had all grown accustomed to being a family unit. "There she is," Davy shouted, running toward her with his sign held high. Sophia dropped her suitcase handle and opened her arms, catching Davy in a hug that lifted him off his feet. "I missed you so much," she said, and Alexander could hear in her voice that she meant it completely. Later, over dinner in their favorite restaurant, the same cafe where they had shared their first real conversation, Sophia told them about her trip. But more than that, she told them about the decision she had been considering for weeks, one that would change everything for all of them. "I've been thinking about relocating the company's headquarters," she said, watching Alexander's face carefully. "There are good business reasons for it, but the main reason is that I want to build my life where my heart is. I want to be here with you and Davy, not just visiting between business trips." Alexander felt a surge of hope mixed with concern. "That's a huge decision, Sophia. You've built everything there. Are you sure you want to uproot your entire life for us?" Sophia reached across the table and took his hand, the gesture natural and comfortable after months of growing intimacy. "I'm not uprooting my life," she said firmly. "I'm finally planting it where it belongs. I've spent years building a successful company, but I want to spend the rest of my years building a successful family." She looked at Davy, who was listening intently while pretending to focus on his dessert. "If that's what you both want too." Davy looked up with chocolate cake on his chin and pure excitement in his eyes. "Does this mean you'll be here for my science fair? And for soccer season? And for Christmas morning?" Sophia laughed, the sound filling the space between them with warmth and promise. "Yes, sweet boy, for all of it." As they walked home through the city streets, Davy running ahead to look in shop windows while Alexander and Sophia followed hand in hand, Alexander reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had started as a case of mistaken identity had revealed itself to be a perfect recognition. Two people finding their way back to each other across years and circumstances that should have kept them apart forever. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of their new home, a modest but comfortable house with a backyard where Davy could conduct his increasingly elaborate science experiments. Sophia had indeed relocated her company, establishing a new headquarters that allowed her to maintain her business success while building the personal life she had never thought possible. The transition hadn't been without challenges. There had been difficult conversations about expectations and boundaries, about how to blend their different worlds without losing what made each of them unique. Davy had needed time to adjust to having Sophia as a permanent presence rather than an exciting visitor. Sophia had to learn the rhythms of family life, the way 9-year-old boys could track mud through a house in 30 seconds, or the precise timing required to have breakfast ready when Alexander returned from his morning run. But they had worked through each adjustment together, with patience and humor and the kind of commitment that comes from people who understand the rarity of what they've found. Alexander had enrolled in evening architecture classes, slowly rebuilding the dreams he had set aside when survival became more important than aspiration. Sophia had scaled back her travel schedule, learning to delegate more effectively so she could be present for soccer games and parent-teacher conferences. On this particular morning, as they sat around the kitchen table sharing breakfast and planning their weekend, Alexander watched Davy explain his latest volcano model to Sophia with the kind of animated enthusiasm that only children possess. Sophia listened with the same serious attention she had always given him, asking technical questions about lava flow and eruption patterns that made Davy feel like his interests were as important as any adult conversation. "Dad?" Davy said suddenly, turning to Alexander with the expression he wore when important thoughts were percolating. "Do you think Mom would have liked Sophia?" The question came without warning, as Davy's most profound observations often did, cutting straight to the heart of things adults spent months thinking around. Alexander felt his breath catch slightly, not from pain, but from the sweetness of his son's concern. They had talked about Sarah many times over the years, keeping her memory alive while allowing space for new love to grow. "I think," Alexander said carefully, looking at Sophia and then back at his son, "your mom would have loved anyone who made us this happy. She would have been grateful that Sophia takes such good care of both of us." Sophia's eyes grew bright with tears she didn't try to hide. She had learned, over these months of building family together, that love didn't require the erasure of what came before. Sarah would always be Davy's mother, would always hold a special place in Alexander's heart, but there was room for new love alongside the old, room for different kinds of happiness to coexist. Plus, Davy added with 9-year-old pragmatism, Mom probably would have liked having someone to help with the volcano projects. Dad's not very good at the artistic parts. Alexander laughed, reaching over to tickle his son's ribs. "Hey, my volcanoes are perfectly functional. They're just not pretty. They're disasters," Davy giggled, squirming away from his father's hands. Sophia's volcanoes actually looked like volcanoes. Sophia had indeed proven surprisingly talented at helping with school projects, bringing the same attention to detail to papier-mâché mountains that she applied to quarterly earnings reports. Later that afternoon, while Davy was at a friend's house working on a group project about the solar system, Alexander and Sophia found themselves alone in their living room, a rare occurrence that they had learned to treasure. Sophia was curled up on one end of the couch, laptop balanced on her knees as she reviewed contracts, while Alexander sat at the other end, sketching preliminary designs for a community center renovation project he had been asked to consult on. It was domestic and comfortable and ordinary in the most extraordinary way. For two people who had both spent years believing that contentment was something that happened to other people, the simple pleasure of shared silence felt like a daily miracle. "I have something to tell you," Sophia said suddenly, closing her laptop and turning to face him with an expression that was equal parts nervous and excited. Alexander set down his pencil, giving her his full attention, though something in her tone made his heart rate quicken slightly. "The detective I hired to find you," she continued. "He finally sent me his complete report last week. The full background investigation." Alexander felt a flutter of concern, wondering what information might have been uncovered about his life, his finances, his past mistakes. "And," he prompted gently. Sophia smiled, reaching into the stack of papers beside her and pulling out a thick folder. "It turns out that the night we met at the hospital, you weren't just there for Sarah's labor complications. You were there because you had been volunteering in the children's cancer ward for over a year, reading stories to sick kids after your construction shifts ended." Alexander blinked in surprise. He had forgotten about those volunteer hours, the way he had started spending time at the hospital after work because building houses for other people felt hollow when he came home to an empty apartment. Sarah had been a pediatric nurse there, and their relationship had grown out of shared coffee breaks and conversations about the resilience of sick children. "The detective found records of your volunteer hours," Sophia continued, "and interview notes from some of the families you helped. One mother wrote about how you sat with her son every Tuesday for 3 months, reading Harry Potter books aloud while he went through chemotherapy. She said you were the only volunteer who never looked uncomfortable around the bald kids, who treated them like they were normal children instead of tragic cases." Alexander felt heat rise in his cheeks, embarrassed by the detailed nature of the investigation, but also touched that those small kindnesses had been remembered. "I just liked reading to them," he said quietly. "They had good imaginations, and they were stuck in those rooms for hours at a time." "Don't you see?" Sophia leaned forward, her eyes bright with something that looked like wonder. "That night in the hospital, when you sat with me, it wasn't a random act of compassion. It was who you were, who you had always been. You were already someone who showed up for broken people, who offered comfort without expecting anything in return." She reached across the couch and took his hands in hers, holding them with the kind of reverence usually reserved for precious artifacts. "I didn't fall in love with you because of one night 12 years ago, Alexander. I fell in love with you because that night revealed something essential about your character that time and hardship haven't changed." The weight of her words settled between them like a blessing. Alexander had spent years thinking of himself as someone who had been diminished by loss, who had become smaller and more careful in response to tragedy. But Sophia saw him differently, saw continuity where he saw only survival, saw strength where he saw only stubbornness. "There's something else," Sophia said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "The detective found out why my father was at the hospital that night. He had been coming there for weeks, getting experimental treatment for pancreatic cancer. He never told me how sick he was because he wanted to protect me from worrying." Alexander squeezed her hands gently, understanding now why that night had been so devastating for her. "You had no idea he was dying." Sophia shook her head, tears gathering in her eyes despite the months of healing that had passed. "None. I thought we had years left together. I had been so busy building my career, proving I could be successful, that I hadn't noticed he was getting sicker. But here's the thing," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "The detective found records showing that on the night my father died, there was a volunteer reader in the children's ward who had requested to stay late because one of the kids was having a particularly difficult treatment day. That volunteer was you, Alexander. You were there, in that building, at that exact time, because you were taking care of a sick child." The coincidence was staggering, the idea that their paths had crossed not randomly, but because they were both people who responded to suffering by showing up, by offering whatever comfort they could provide. Alexander felt overwhelmed by the interconnectedness of it all, the way their individual choices had created the possibility of their meeting. "I keep thinking about that," Sophia said softly. "How many small decisions led us to that bench? Your choice to volunteer, my father's choice to seek treatment, my choice to drive to the hospital alone instead of waiting for a cab. It's like the universe spent months arranging the pieces just right. They sat together in the fading afternoon light, processing the magnitude of fate and choice that had brought them together. Outside, they could hear the sounds of neighborhood children playing, the distant hum of traffic, the ordinary symphony of life continuing around them. But inside their living room, wrapped in understanding and recognition, they felt connected to something larger than coincidence. That evening, as they prepared dinner together while waiting for Davy to return from his friend's house, Alexander found himself thinking about the different kinds of love he had experienced in his lifetime. His love for Sarah had been young and passionate, built on shared dreams and the excitement of building a life together from scratch. It had been beautiful and complete, and her death had nearly destroyed him. His love for Sophia was different, deeper in some ways because it was informed by loss and shaped by gratitude. It was the love of two people who had survived their own catastrophes and chosen to trust again, who had found each other not in spite of their scars, but because of them. It was quieter than first love, but no less powerful, like the difference between lightning and sunrise. "I want to ask you something," Alexander said as they worked side by side, Sophia chopping vegetables while he stirred a pot of sauce. "And I want you to think carefully before you answer." Sophia looked up from her cutting board, noting the serious tone in his voice. "Okay, are you happy?" he asked simply. "Not content, not satisfied with how things worked out, but genuinely happy. Because I need to know that this life we're building together is what you want, not just what you think you should want." Sophia set down her knife and turned to face him fully, her expression thoughtful and sincere. "Do you know what I used to think happiness was?" she asked. "I thought it was achievement, recognition, the satisfaction of closing a difficult deal or exceeding quarterly projections. I thought it was having enough money to buy whatever I wanted, enough influence to make things happen the way I thought they should." She gestured around their modest kitchen, with its mismatched dishes and Davy's artwork covering the refrigerator door. "This morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of you and Davy arguing about whether dinosaurs could have survived the Ice Age. Tonight, I'll help Davy with his homework and listen to him practice his presentation about the water cycle. Tomorrow, we'll all go to his soccer game and cheer too loudly when he kicks the ball in the wrong direction." Her eyes grew bright with tears of joy rather than sadness. "Alexander, I spent 12 years building a successful life, but I've never been as happy as I am washing dishes and helping with science projects and falling asleep next to someone who thinks I'm beautiful even when I'm wearing my old pajamas and have volcano ash in my hair from Davy's latest experiment." She stepped closer, placing her hands on his chest and looking directly into his eyes. "This is happiness, Alexander. This messy, ordinary, extraordinary life we're building together. This is what I was searching for without knowing it." Just then, they heard Davy's voice calling from the front door, announcing his return with the kind of volume that suggested he had important news to share. "Dad, Sophia, wait until you hear what happened at Michael's house." His footsteps thundered through the hallway, and within seconds he burst into the kitchen, backpack flying behind him and face flushed with excitement. "We made a volcano that actually works," he announced breathlessly. "Like, with real chemical reactions and everything. Michael's mom is a chemistry teacher, and she showed us how to make it foam up and change colors, and..." He launched into a detailed explanation of their scientific adventure, complete with hand gestures and sound effects that filled the kitchen with boyish enthusiasm. Alexander and Sophia exchanged glances over Davy's head, sharing the kind of wordless communication that develops between people who have learned to see the world through the same lens. In their son's excitement, they saw the future they were building together, filled with science projects and soccer games, homework help and bedtime stories, the countless small moments that add up to a life well lived. Later that night, after Davy had finally exhausted himself talking about chemical reactions and had been tucked into bed with promises that they would attempt their own color-changing volcano experiment over the weekend, Alexander and Sophia sat together on their back porch, sharing a cup of tea and watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky. "I've been thinking about something," Sophia said quietly, her head resting on Alexander's shoulder. "About that night 12 years ago, and what it means that we found each other again." Alexander waited, enjoying the weight of her against him and the peaceful silence of their neighborhood settling into evening rest. "I used to think that night was about me being saved," she continued. "About you rescuing me from despair when I couldn't save myself. But now I think it was about both of us learning that we weren't alone, that kindness still existed in the world even when everything felt hopeless. She lifted her head to look at him, her expression thoughtful and peaceful. Maybe the real miracle isn't that we found each other again. Maybe it's that we were both people who believed love was worth the risk, even after we'd lost everything that mattered most. Alexander considered her words, thinking about the journey that had brought them from that hospital corridor to this back porch, from strangers sharing silent comfort to partners building a life together. I think you're right, he said finally. I think we recognized something in each other that night that we couldn't name at the time. Something about refusing to let tragedy make us smaller or less capable of caring. They sat together under the stars, wrapped in blankets and shared understanding, talking about dreams they were finally ready to pursue and plans they wanted to make together. The conversation meandered from practical concerns about Davy's education to abstract hopes about the kind of legacy they wanted to leave behind, the way long-term partners can move seamlessly between the mundane and the meaningful. As the night grew later and they prepared to go inside, Sophia turned to Alexander with a smile that carried all the warmth and promise of their shared future. "Thank you," she said simply, "for that night 12 years ago, for picking up the wrong woman at the airport, for making room in your life for someone who never forgot your kindness." Alexander kissed her forehead gently, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair and the contentment that had become as natural as breathing. "Thank you for remembering," he replied, "for searching until you found me, for seeing something worth loving in a man who had forgotten how to hope." Inside their house, Davy slept peacefully, his dreams undoubtedly filled with exploding volcanoes and chemical reactions, surrounded by the security of knowing he was loved by two adults who had chosen each other and him with equal devotion. In the living room, family photos shared shelf space with Sophia's business awards and Alexander's architectural sketches, evidence of lives that had been separate for years but were now irrevocably intertwined. And in their bedroom, as Alexander and Sophia settled into sleep, they carried with them the quiet satisfaction of people who had learned that love doesn't always arrive with fanfare and dramatic declarations. Sometimes it arrives disguised as a case of mistaken identity, wearing the face of someone who once offered comfort to a stranger and never expected to see them again. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with lightning bolts, but with the simple recognition that you have found your way home to someone who has been waiting, without knowing it, for you to arrive.